Margaret huddled under the thin blanket in her usual spot behind the public library. The autumn wind cut through her worn jacket, and her prosthetic leg ached from the cold. She'd lost her leg 5 years ago in the accident that took everything from her: her job as a nurse, her small apartment, and finally her dignity. But she never lost her humanity. The streets of New York weren't kind to anyone, especially not to a disabled woman in her 50s. People walked past her every day, their eyes sliding away as if she were invisible. Sometimes she wondered if she had become a ghost, haunting these busy sidewalks where life rushed by without noticing her. That Tuesday started like any other day. Margaret woke up early, folded her blanket, and made her way to the small diner, where Jimmy, the kind-hearted owner, sometimes gave her leftover coffee and day-old pastries. She was sitting on her usual bench in Central Park, savoring the warmth of the coffee cup between her hands, when she saw it. A man in an expensive suit rushed past, talking angrily on his phone. He set down a leather briefcase on the bench next to hers, then walked a few steps away, gesturing wildly as he argued with someone. Margaret watched as he suddenly turned and hurried away, leaving the briefcase behind. "Sir," she called out, but her voice was too weak, too unused to being heard. He disappeared into the crowd. Margaret looked at the briefcase. It would be dark soon, and this park wasn't safe at night. Someone might steal it. With difficulty, she got up, steadying herself on her crutch. The briefcase was heavy, but she managed to secure it. She opened it just enough to look for some identification. Instead, she found stacks of $100 bills. Her hands trembled. There must have been at least $100,000 there. More money than she'd seen in her entire life. For a moment, Margaret let herself imagine what she could do with that money. She could get a new prosthetic leg, one that didn't hurt so much. She could rent a small room, sleep in a real bed again. She could buy warm clothes for the winter that was coming, but the money wasn't hers. She closed the briefcase and held it tight. On the gold-plated lock, she noticed an engraving. Hawthorne Industries. She knew that building. It was the tall glass tower that cast shadows over her usual spot in the afternoons. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She guarded the briefcase, holding it close, ignoring the whispers of temptation in her mind. When morning came, she made her way to the Hawthorne building, her progress slow and painful without her crutch, which she'd had to leave behind to carry the briefcase. The security guards at the entrance looked at her with suspicion and disgust. "Ma'am, you need to leave," one of them said firmly. "Please," Margaret's voice was hoarse. "I need to see Mr. Hawthorne. I found his briefcase." The guards exchanged looks. One of them made a phone call. Minutes later, a group of men in suits rushed down, their faces tense. Among them was the man from the park. Daniel Hawthorne looked different in the daylight, younger than she'd expected, maybe in his early 40s, with sharp features and cold eyes. Those eyes widened when he saw the briefcase in her lap. "So we need to check the contents," one of his assistants said, reaching for the briefcase. Margaret handed it over without hesitation. "It's all there," she said quietly. "I didn't take anything." The assistant quickly counted the money while Hawthorne stared at her. She could feel his gaze taking in her shabby clothes, her missing leg, the dirt on her hands. "You could have kept it," he finally said, his voice filled with disbelief. "Why didn't you?" Margaret looked up at him, meeting his eyes. "Because it wasn't mine." The simplicity of her answer seemed to shake him. He cleared his throat. "I need to repay you somehow. Name your price." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. She hadn't cried in years. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford on the streets. But now they came unbidden. "Can I ask for one thing?" "Anything," he said, probably expecting her to name a sum of money. "Can you say my name?" The words came, out in a whisper. "What?" He frowned, confused. "No one has said my name in years," Margaret explained, her voice trembling. "People look through me, past me. Sometimes I wonder if I'm still real. I just want to hear someone say my name again." Daniel Hawthorne's face changed. The coldness in his eyes melted, replaced by something else, understanding perhaps, or shame. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Margaret," she said, a tear rolling down her cheek. Margaret Collins. He took a deep breath. Margaret, he repeated, and her name in his mouth sounded like something precious, something worthy. Margaret Collins. And in that moment something shifted in the universe, not because a rich man had spoken to a homeless woman, but because, for the first time in years, Margaret felt human again. Daniel Hawthorne couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Margaret's face, heard her simple request echoing in his mind. He'd built his empire by being tough, by seeing the world in black and white, profits and losses. But today, something had cracked in that perfect world. He got up from his king-sized bed and walked to his home office. The city lights twinkled below his penthouse window, but somewhere down there, Margaret was probably huddled in some dark corner, trying to stay warm. "What's wrong with me?" he muttered, running his hands through his hair. He'd given her money, of course, had his assistant write a check for $10,000. Margaret had tried to refuse it, but he'd insisted. It was a fair reward, he'd told himself, more than fair. So why did he feel so hollow? His phone rang, startling him. It was Victoria, his fiancée. "Darling, I just heard about what happened. Are you okay? Was anything stolen?" Victoria's voice was high-pitched with concern. "I'm fine," Daniel said. "Nothing was stolen. A homeless woman found the briefcase and returned it." "A homeless woman?" Victoria's tone changed. "Well, I hope you had security check her thoroughly. Those people can be very cunning, you know. She probably has accomplices." Daniel felt a surge of anger. "Her name is Margaret," he said sharply, "and she returned $100,000 without taking a single bill." "Oh," Victoria paused. "Well, that's nice. Anyway, don't forget about the charity gala tomorrow night. The press will be there, and we need to show a united front after that nasty article about the factory layoffs." After hanging up, Daniel sat in his leather chair, thinking. The charity gala. His company donated millions to various causes each year. It was good for public relations. But had he ever really cared about where that money went? Had he ever looked into the eyes of someone who needed help? The next morning, he arrived at his office earlier than usual. "Sandra," he called his secretary, "I need you to find someone." "For me, of course, Mr. Hawthorne. Who?" "A homeless woman named Margaret Collins. She has a prosthetic leg. She usually stays near the public library." Sandra looked surprised but nodded. An hour later, she came back with a file. "Sir, I found some information. Margaret Collins, 52 years old, former nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital. Lost her leg in a car accident 5 years ago. The insurance company denied her claim due to a technicality, and she couldn't afford the medical bills. Lost her apartment, and then became invisible," Daniel finished, remembering Margaret's words. He spent the morning in meetings, but his mind kept wandering. The board was pushing for more layoffs at the factory in Ohio. "It's just business," they said, "just numbers on a spreadsheet." How many of those workers were one paycheck away from becoming invisible too? That afternoon, he cancelled his lunch with Victoria and drove to the public library. He found Margaret in the small park behind it, sitting on a bench with a book in her lap. She looked up as he approached, surprise flickering across her face. "Mr. Hawthorne?" "Daniel," he corrected. "May I sit?" Margaret moved over, making space. Up close, he could see how thin she was, how her clothes hung loose on her frame. But her eyes were clear and intelligent as she watched him. "What are you reading?" he asked. She showed him the cover. "To Kill a Mockingbird." "They let you borrow books?" "The librarian, Mrs. Chen, she's kind. She lets me read here during the day." Margaret's voice was stronger than yesterday, less hesitant. "Books help me remember who I am. In stories, everyone matters, even the invisible people." Daniel felt that crack in his world growing wider. "Tell me about being a nurse," he said. For the next hour, Margaret told him about her life, about the patients she'd cared for, the lives she'd touched, about the accident that had taken her leg, and how the insurance company, one he had shares in, he realized with a jolt, had abandoned her when she needed them most. "The hardest part wasn't losing my leg," she said, looking at her prosthetic. "It was losing my purpose. Nurses help people. That's who I was. And then suddenly, I was the one who needed help, and nobody was there." Daniel checked his watch and stood up. "I have to go. There's a charity gala tonight." Margaret nodded, already retreating into herself, probably expecting to never see him again. "But first," he said, "I need your help with something." She looked up, confused. "You were a nurse. You helped people. I want you to help me understand something." He took a deep breath. "Every year, my company donates millions to charity, but I've never really known where it should go. Will you help me? Help me see what I've been blind to." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she smiled. "You want my help?" "Yes," Daniel said, "and I want to start tonight. Will you come to the gala with me?" Margaret looked down at her shabby clothes, touched her tangled hair self-consciously. I'm not. You're exactly who needs to be there," Daniel said firmly. "These people donate millions without ever meeting the people they claim to help. It's time they met someone real." He held out his hand. "What do you say, Margaret Collins? Ready to become visible again?" Margaret looked at his hand for a long moment. Then slowly she reached out and took it. Neither of them knew it then, but that simple gesture would change not only their lives, but the lives of countless others. Because sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness, like saying someone's name or really seeing them for the first time. Victoria Hawthorne stood in front of her full-length mirror, adjusting her diamond necklace. The charity gala would start in 2 hours, and everything needed to be perfect. Her red designer dress cost more than most people made in a month, but that was the point. In her world, appearance was everything. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Daniel. "I'm bringing someone to the gala, a special guest." Victoria frowned. Daniel never brought unexpected guests to events. She tried calling him, but the call went straight to voicemail. Something wasn't right. Meanwhile, across town, Margaret sat nervously in a chair at New York's most exclusive salon. Daniel had brought her there directly from the park, ignoring the shocked looks from the staff. "Mr. Hawthorne," the salon owner, had started to protest, but Daniel cut her off. "Give her whatever she needs," he said. "Hair, makeup, everything." Now, as the stylist worked on her hair, Margaret barely recognized herself in the mirror. The gray had been covered with warm brown color, and her tangled locks were being transformed into soft waves. Her hands, clean for the first time in months, trembled in her lap. "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, noticing her nervousness. "I don't belong in this world," Margaret whispered. "These people, they'll know I'm not one of them." Daniel knelt beside her chair, not caring about his expensive suit. "You're right. You're not one of them. You're better. You're real." After the salon, they went to a boutique that had been kept open specially for them. The owner, an elegant woman named Sophia, took one look at Margaret's prosthetic leg and immediately knew what to do. "I have just the thing," she said, bringing out a beautiful dark blue gown with a subtle slit that would accommodate Margaret's prosthetic while making her feel elegant. "This color will bring out your eyes." As Margaret changed into the dress, Daniel made another call. "Dr. Martinez, yes, I need a favor. How quickly can you get a new prosthetic leg fitted?" By the time they arrived at the gala, Margaret looked transformed on the outside, but inside she was still trembling. The Plaza Hotel's ballroom was filled with New York's elite, all dressed in their finest, all playing their parts in this elaborate show of wealth and charity. Victoria spotted them as soon as they entered. Her perfect smile froze on her face as she saw Daniel walking in with a woman she didn't recognize. A beautiful woman, elegantly dressed, but something about her was different. There was a slight unevenness in her walk, a hesitation that came from years of pain. "Daniel, darling." Victoria rushed over, her voice honey-sweet but her eyes sharp. "Who's your guest?" "Victoria, this is Margaret Collins," Daniel said firmly. "Margaret, my fiancée, Victoria Chase." Victoria's eyes widened as she made the connection. "The homeless woman? Daniel, have you lost your mind?" Several heads turned their way. Daniel felt Margaret tense beside him, but before he could speak, she straightened her shoulders and looked Victoria directly in the eye. "Yes, I am homeless," Margaret said, her voice clear and steady. "I'm also a former nurse who lost everything because of an insurance company's greed. I'm one of the invisible people you all pretend not to see every day. But tonight, I'm here to be seen." A hush fell over the nearby crowd. Victoria's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. "How dare you," she hissed. This is a respected charity event, not some soup kitchen. Exactly, Daniel said loudly, making sure everyone could hear. This is a charity event. But how? Many of us here actually know the people we claim to help. How many of us have looked them in the eye and learned their names? He turned to address the crowd that had gathered around them. Everyone, I want you to meet Margaret Collins. 5 years ago, she was a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital, saving lives every day. Then she lost her leg in an accident. The insurance company, one that many of us here own shares in, denied her claim. She lost everything. And do you know what she did when she found my briefcase with $100,000 in it? She returned every single dollar, the crowd murmured. Phones came out recording the scene. Tomorrow, this would be all over the social pages, but not in the way Victoria had planned. Margaret taught me something important, Daniel continued. She taught me that dignity isn't something you can buy. It's something you give, by seeing people, by saying their names, by remembering that every person has value. An older man stepped forward from the crowd. Margaret recognized him from the newspapers, James Morrison, one of the city's biggest hospital administrators. You worked at Mount Sinai? He asked Margaret. Yes, in the pediatric ward, she replied, for 15 years. Morrison nodded slowly. We need experienced nurses, especially ones who understand what our patients go through. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. Come see me on Monday. Tears filled Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them back. This wasn't the time for crying. This was the time for standing tall, for being seen. Victoria watched in horror as more people came forward to talk to Margaret. Her perfect charity gala had turned into something else entirely, something real. She grabbed Daniel's arm and pulled him aside. What are you doing? This isn't like you. Since when do you care about homeless people? Daniel looked at his fiancée, really looked at her, and for the first time he saw her clearly too. Maybe that's the problem, Victoria. Maybe it's time I started being someone else. Across the room, Margaret was talking to a group of doctors about the challenges faced by disabled patients. Her eyes were bright, her voice confident. She was in her element, sharing her knowledge, making a difference. And Daniel realized something. That would change everything. He was falling in love. Not with the elegant woman in the blue dress, but with the soul beneath. The woman who had returned his money, who had asked only to hear her name, who had shown him what true dignity looked like. But as he watched her, he didn't notice Victoria, slipping away to make a phone call. She had worked too hard to let some homeless woman ruin everything. If Daniel wouldn't see reason, she would have to take matters into her own hands. Hello? Yes, I need you to do some digging. Find out everything you can about Margaret Collins. Everyone has secrets. Find hers. The night was far from over, and the real drama was just beginning. The morning after the gala, newspapers and social media were buzzing with the story. Pictures of Margaret and Daniel were everywhere, along with headlines like "Billionaire's Homeless Hero Steals the Show" and "Love at First Sight at Charity Gala." Victoria threw the newspaper across her luxury apartment's breakfast table, her perfectly manicured hands shaking with rage. The headlines were bad enough, but the photos were worse. The way Daniel looked at Margaret, she'd never seen him look at anyone like that before, not even her. Her phone rang. It was Roger, the private investigator she'd hired. Tell me you found something, Victoria demanded. It's complicated, Roger said. Her story checks out. 15 years as a pediatric nurse, spotless record, the accident, everything. But, what? There's something about her son. Victoria sat up straighter. Son? What son? Timothy Collins. He was 12 when Margaret had her accident. After she lost everything, social services took him. He's 17 now, living with a foster family in New Jersey. A slow smile spread across Victoria's face. Find out everything about him. And Roger, make sure no one knows you're looking. Across town, Daniel had brought Margaret to see her new apartment. It wasn't huge or luxurious. He knew she wouldn't want that, but it was clean and bright with large windows and furniture chosen for both comfort and accessibility. I can't accept this, Margaret protested, even as her eyes filled with tears at the sight of a real bed. Yes, you can, Daniel said firmly. You start work at the hospital next week. You need a proper place to live. Margaret ran her hand over the soft couch. remembering how long it had been since she'd sat on anything but park benches and sidewalks. "Why are you doing all this?" Daniel stepped closer to her. "Because you made me see what I'd been blind to, because you showed me what real strength looks like." He paused, his heart racing. "Because I think I'm falling in love with you." Margaret stepped back, shaking her head. "No, you can't. You're engaged, and You're what? Strong? Compassionate? The most genuine person I've ever met?" "I'm broken," Margaret whispered. "In more ways than you know." Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant. "Urgent board meeting in an hour." "I have to go," he said reluctantly. "But we're not done talking about this." At Hawthorne Industries, the boardroom was tense. Victoria sat at the table, looking perfectly composed. She'd called this emergency meeting, citing concerns about the company's public image. "The press coverage from the gala is problematic," she began. "Our shareholders are concerned about Daniel's recent behavior." Richard Matthews, the oldest board member, nodded. "Dancing with a homeless woman at a charity event is one thing, but there are rumors you're planning to hire her at one of our hospitals." "Her name is Margaret," Daniel said through gritted teeth, "and she's more qualified than half the nurses we currently employ." "That's not the point," Victoria cut in smoothly. "The point is you're making decisions based on emotion rather than business sense. It's affecting investor confidence." "Maybe it's time we let emotion affect our decisions," Daniel argued. "Do. You know how many people lose everything because of medical bills? How many end up on the streets because companies like ours prioritize profit over people?" "Oh, please," Victoria rolled her eyes. "Next you'll tell us you're going to house every homeless person in New York." "Not everyone," Daniel said quietly. "But maybe we can start with one and then another and another." The board members exchanged worried looks. This wasn't the Daniel Hawthorne they knew, the ruthless businessman who never let sentiment cloud his judgment. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her new apartment, overwhelmed by everything that had happened. She picked up a framed photo Daniel had found and placed on the shelf, her nursing graduation picture. She looked so young, so hopeful. Her hand trembled as she opened her worn wallet and pulled out another photo, one she kept hidden from the world. A smiling boy with her eyes and his father's dimples. "I'm sorry, Timmy," she whispered. "I'm so sorry I failed you." The doorbell rang, startling her. When she opened it, a delivery man handed her a large envelope. Inside was a single sheet of a paper with a typed message. "Does Daniel know about Timothy? About what really happened the night of the accident? Keep playing Cinderella if you want, but remember, every fairy tale has an ending." Margaret sank to the floor, the paper crumpling in her hands. She thought those secrets were buried in the past, hidden under years of pain and shame. But someone had found them. Her phone rang. It was Daniel. She let it go to voicemail, her hands shaking too badly to answer. His voice filled the empty apartment. "Margaret, the board meeting was rough, but I don't care what they think. I meant what I said earlier. I'm falling in love with you, and I'm not going to hide it. Call me back when you can. We have so much to talk about." Margaret looked at the threatening note, then at Timmy's photo. She'd lost him once because of her mistakes. Now, just when she'd found a chance at happiness, the past was coming back to destroy everything. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Daniel too, for the good he could do, for the change he wanted to make. She couldn't let her past ruin that. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd memorized, but never had the courage to call. "Social services. My name is Margaret Collins. I need to know about my son, Timothy Collins." The sun was setting outside her window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Somewhere in that city, Victoria was plotting her next move. Daniel was fighting his own battles in the boardroom. And Timothy. Timothy was out there too, maybe wondering if his mother ever thought about him. Margaret straightened her shoulders. She'd survived losing her leg, losing her son, losing everything. She'd survived years on the streets. She could survive this too. But first, she had to tell Daniel the truth, all of it, before someone else did. The social worker's office was small and cramped, with filing cabinets lining the walls and the smell of old coffee in the air. Margaret sat stiffly in the uncomfortable chair, her hands clutched tightly in her lap. Timothy Collins, the social worker, Mrs. Reynolds, read from her computer screen. "Yes, I have his file here. He's doing well in his foster home. Honor student, captain of the debate team. Margaret's heart swelled with pride and pain. Can I see him? Mrs. Reynolds looked at her with sympathy. He's 17 now, Ms. Collins. It's his choice whether he wants contact or not. I can send a request to his foster family. Please, Margaret whispered. Tell him I'm better now. I have a job, a place to live. Tell him I never stopped loving him. As she left the office, her phone buzzed again. Another message from Daniel. The 10th one today. She'd been avoiding him since receiving the threatening note, but she knew she couldn't hide forever. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her private investigator's office, looking through the file he'd compiled. The accident report is interesting, Roger said, pointing to a highlighted section. Margaret wasn't alone in the car that night. Timothy was with her, and there was alcohol involved. Victoria's eyes gleamed. So our perfect nurse was drinking and driving with her child in the car. How deliciously scandalous. There's more, Roger continued. The accident, it wasn't just bad luck. Someone cut her brakes. Victoria frowned. What? Who? The police never solved it, but there were rumors about Margaret's ex-husband. He'd been threatening her, fighting for custody. After the accident, he disappeared, never been found. Victoria sat back, processing this information. This was better than she'd hoped. Not just one scandal, but layers of them. A drunk driving accident, a missing ex-husband, an abandoned child. By the time she was done, Margaret's fairy tale would turn into a nightmare. Across town, Daniel sat in his office, staring at his phone. Why wasn't Margaret answering his calls? Had he scared her away by confessing his feelings? Or was it something else? His secretary buzzed him. Mr. Hawthorne? There's a young man here to see you, says it's about Margaret Collins. Daniel's heart jumped. Send him in. The teenager who walked into his office looked painfully familiar. He had Margaret's eyes. I'm Timothy Collins, the boy said, his voice steady despite his obvious nervousness. And I need to know what you want with my mother. Daniel gestured for Timothy to sit. How did you find me? It wasn't hard. You're all over the news with her. Timothy's hands clenched into fists. Everyone at school is talking about it. The homeless woman who captured a billionaire's heart. But they don't know the truth. What truth? Timothy's eyes filled with tears. The truth about what really happened the night of the accident. The night she chose alcohol over me. Daniel felt his world tilt. What are you talking about? She was drunk, Timothy said bitterly. We were driving home from my baseball game. I'd made the winning pitch. She said we should celebrate. I begged her to let me call Dad to pick us up, but she wouldn't listen. She said she was fine, and then he stopped, his voice breaking. Daniel waited, his heart pounding. The brakes didn't work. We went off the road. I remember screaming. When I woke up in the hospital, they told me Mum had lost her leg. But I'd lost everything. My home, my family, my trust in her. Daniel struggled to reconcile this story with the Margaret he knew. Have you talked to her since then? Timothy shook his head. My foster parents tried to arrange visits, but I refused. How could I face her? How could I tell her that I saw Dad tampering with the car that morning? That I knew what he was planning but was too scared to say anything? Daniel's breath caught. Your father cut the brakes? He said he was just checking them, Timothy whispered. But I heard him on the phone the night before, arguing with someone about Mom getting full custody. He said he'd rather see her dead than let her take me away. The pieces started falling into place in Daniel's mind. So the accident wasn't your mother's fault. But why didn't she fight the drunk driving charge? Because of me, Timothy said, tears running down his face now. The police found alcohol in her system, but it was Dad's beer. I spilled it on her when we crashed. She could have fought it, could have told them about Dad, but he was still out there, and she was afraid. So she let them take me away, let them think the worst of her to keep me safe. Daniel stood up abruptly. We need to find your mother now. But before they could move, his office door burst open. Victoria stood there, her face flushed with triumph. Daniel, darling, I'm so glad I caught you. Have you seen the evening news? They're running quite an interesting story about your precious Margaret. She turned on the office TV. There it was, splashed across the screen. Homeless hero's dark past. Drunk driving, child endangerment and a missing husband. Timothy stared at the TV in horror. No, this isn't right. You don't understand. But Victoria wasn't finished. Oh, I understand perfectly. Your mother is a fraud, dear boy. And now, everyone will know it. Daniel grabbed his phone, trying Margaret's number again. This time she answered on the first ring. Daniel, her voice was broken, defeated. I was going to tell you everything. I know, Margaret. I know about the accident, about Timothy's father. You're not alone anymore. We're coming to get you. There was a pause, then a sharp intake of breath. He's here. Who's here? Frank. Timothy's father. He's standing outside my apartment. The phone went dead. Timothy went pale. Dad, but he disappeared years ago. Daniel was already moving, grabbing his coat. Call the police. Tell them everything. Victoria, if you try to spin this story before we get to the truth, I'll make sure every newspaper in the country knows how you tried to destroy an innocent woman to save your own social status. Victoria's smug smile faltered. You wouldn't dare. Try me. Daniel looked at Timothy. Coming? The boy nodded, determination replacing fear on his face. She protected me all these years. Now it's my turn to protect her. As they raced through the city streets, Daniel's mind raced even faster. Margaret wasn't just fighting for her dignity anymore. She was fighting for her life. And this time, she wouldn't have to fight alone. Margaret stood at her apartment window, her heart pounding. Frank hadn't changed much in 5 years, still tall and broad-shouldered, with the same cold eyes she remembered from their last confrontation. He was leaning against a car across the street, staring directly at her building. She moved away from the window, her hands shaking as she picked up her phone again. The news was everywhere now, her past splashed across every screen in the city. But they had it all wrong. The drinking, the accident, Frank's disappearance. None of it happened the way they were saying. A loud knock at her door made her jump. Margaret, Frank's voice, the same voice that had haunted her nightmares for years. Open up, sweetheart. We need to talk. She backed away from the door, looking frantically around the apartment. The fire escape. She could make it even with her prosthetic leg. I saw you on TV, Frank continued, his voice deceptively gentle. Looking real pretty at that fancy party. Made quite a splash, didn't you? Our boy must have seen it too. Margaret's breath caught. Timothy. Had Frank found him? Leave him alone, she called out, her voice stronger than she felt. He's safe now. A harsh laugh from the other side of the door. Safe? You think those rich people you're cozying up to can keep him safe from me? I'm his father. You lost that right when you tried to kill us. The pounding on the door got louder. Is that what you think happened? You always did have a talent for twisting things around. Maybe I should go tell your new boyfriend what really happened that night. Margaret's phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. We're 5 minutes away. Police are coming. Hold on. But the door was already splintering under. Frank's assault. Margaret grabbed her crutch. She could use it as a weapon if she had to. She'd spent 5 years being invisible, powerless. Not anymore. The door burst open. Frank stood there, his face twisted with rage and something else. Desperation. You ruined everything, he snarled. I had debts to pay. That insurance money would have fixed everything. But you had to survive, didn't you? Margaret's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The insurance. That's what this was all about. You tried to kill me for insurance money? The plan was perfect. Frank's control was cracking. You'd have a tragic accident, I'd get the insurance payout, all my problems would be solved. But you survived, and then you started asking questions about the brakes. So you disappeared, Margaret finished. Let everyone think I was the drunk driver who endangered our son. You destroyed my life, took my child away, all for money. Frank moved closer, his hands clenching into fists. And now you're doing it again. Getting close to that billionaire, probably planning to take his money too. You always were good at playing the victim. The only victim here was our son, Margaret said, raising her crutch. He lost both his parents because of your greed. Drop. It, Frank growled, pulling something from his jacket, a gun. You're coming with me. We're going to pay your rich boyfriend a visit. Get what I should have gotten 5 years ago. Margaret's grip on the crutch tightened. No? The word hung in the air between them. Frank's eyebrows rose. No? I spent 5 years being afraid of you, Margaret said. 5 years letting you destroy my life, not anymore. She swung the crutch just as Frank lunged forward. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the small apartment. Margaret felt a searing pain in her shoulder, but adrenaline kept her moving. The crutch connected with Frank's hand, sending the gun skittering across the floor. They grappled, Margaret, fighting with a strength she didn't know she had. Her prosthetic leg threw her off balance, but she used it to her advantage, letting herself fall and pulling Frank down with her. "Mom!" Timothy's voice. Margaret's heart stopped. He was in the doorway, Daniel right behind him. Frank froze at the sight of his son. Timmy? That moment of distraction was all the police needed. They swarmed into the apartment, weapons drawn. "NYPD, hands where we can see them." As they handcuffed Frank, he kept staring at Timothy. "Son, I never meant. I was trying to give us a better life." But Timothy wasn't looking at his father. He ran to Margaret, who was being helped up by Daniel. "Mom, you're bleeding." "It's just a graze," Margaret said, though the pain was getting worse. "Timothy, my boy, I'm so sorry." "No." Timothy cut her off, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, I saw Dad messing with the car that day. I should have told you. All these years I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself." Margaret pulled him close with her good arm, not caring about the pain. "None of this was your fault. You were just a child." As paramedics rushed in to treat Margaret's wound, Victoria appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "Daniel," she started, but he cut her off. "It's over, Victoria. You wanted a scandal. You've got one. The board will be very interested to hear how you tried to destroy an innocent woman's life." Victoria's composure cracked. "I was protecting you, protecting our company." "No," Daniel said quietly. "You were protecting yourself, and now you've lost everything." As they loaded Frank into a police car outside, reporters were already gathering. The story was changing by the minute, from a scandal about a drunk driving homeless woman to a tale of a mother's sacrifice, a father's betrayal, and a son's journey to the truth. In the ambulance, Margaret held Timothy's hand while a paramedic bandaged her shoulder. Daniel sat on her other side, his presence steady and strong. "What happens now?" Timothy asked. Margaret looked at her son, then at Daniel. 5 years ago, she'd lost everything trying to protect her child. Now, somehow, she'd gotten it all back, and more. "Now," she said, "we start healing, together." Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, witnesses to a story that had started with a lost briefcase and ended with found truths. And somewhere in those lights, a new story was beginning, one of second chances, redemption, and the kind of love that sees past appearances to the heart beneath. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beeping of monitors. Margaret sat, propped up in bed, her shoulder bandaged, watching the morning news on the small TV mounted on the wall. Her story was everywhere, not the twisted version Victoria had tried to spread, but the truth. "Local businessman arrested in 5-year-old murder attempt," the headline read. Homeless hero's name cleared. Timothy had fallen asleep in the chair beside her bed, his young face peaceful for the first time since their reunion. He looked so much older than the 12-year-old boy she remembered, yet somehow still so innocent. A soft knock at the door made her look up. Daniel stood there holding a cup of coffee and a stack of papers. "How are you feeling?" he asked quietly, trying not to wake Timothy. "Like I've been shot," Margaret attempted a smile, "but also free. For the first time in 5 years, I feel free." Daniel sat on the edge of her bed, careful not to jostle her injured shoulder. The police found evidence in Frank's car, notes about his gambling debts, the insurance policy, everything. He'd been planning it for months. And all this time, "I thought I deserved to lose everything." Margaret's voice broke. "I thought I'd failed as a mother." "You never failed." Timothy's voice startled them both. He sat up, rubbing his eyes. "You protected me even when I hated you for it." A nurse came in to check Margaret's vitals. "Mrs. Collins, Dr. Martinez is here to see you about your new prosthetic fitting." "Already?" Margaret looked surprised. Daniel smiled. "I may have pulled some strings. The best doctors, the best equipment. You'll be dancing again in no time." "Dancing?" Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I haven't danced since the gala," Daniel finished. "And you were magnificent." Timothy watched their exchange with a knowing smile. "Mom, is there something you want to tell me about you and Mr. Hawthorne?" Margaret blushed, but before she could answer, another visitor appeared at the door. James Morrison, the hospital administrator from the gala. "Ms. Collins," he said warmly, "I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to discuss your position at the hospital. That is, if you're still interested." "Even after everything that's happened?" Morrison's eyes were kind. "Especially after everything that's happened. We need nurses who understand trauma, who know what it means to fight back from rock bottom. And your record at Mount Sinai was exemplary." Timothy sat up straighter. "You're going back to nursing?" "If they'll have me," Margaret said softly. "We'll do better than that," Morrison continued. "We're starting a new program for homeless patients, helping them navigate the healthcare system and get back on their feet. We need someone to run it, someone who's been there." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You want me to run the program?" "Who better?" Daniel interjected. "You've lived it. You know what these people need better than anyone." A commotion in the hallway interrupted them. Victoria's voice could be heard arguing with security. "I need to see Daniel. This is ridiculous. Do you know who I am?" Daniel stood with a sigh. "I should handle this," but Margaret caught his hand. "We should handle this together." She looked at Timothy. "All of us." Victoria burst into the room, her usual perfect appearance slightly disheveled. She stopped short at the sight of them all together, Margaret in the hospital bed, Timothy protective at her side, Daniel holding her hand. "The board meeting is in an hour," Victoria said, trying to maintain her composure. "Daniel, you need to be there. Your whole future is at stake." "No, Victoria," Daniel said calmly. "Your future is at stake. The board has already seen the evidence, not just about Frank's crimes, but about your attempt to destroy Margaret's reputation. Your resignation letter is probably being drafted as we speak." Victoria's face crumpled. "You're choosing her. This charity case." "I'm choosing truth," Daniel replied. "I'm choosing compassion. And yes, I'm choosing love." Margaret's breath caught at the word. Timothy squeezed her hand. Victoria looked around the room, at Morrison's disapproving face, at Timothy's protective stance, at the way Daniel and Margaret's hands remained linked. She saw what she'd lost, not just a fiancé or a position of power, but her humanity. "I never meant," she started, then stopped. "I didn't understand." "No," Margaret said quietly. "You didn't, but maybe now you will." Victoria left without another word, her heels clicking down the hospital corridor for the last time. Morrison cleared his throat. "Well, I should get back to work. Margaret, take all the time you need to recover. Your position will be waiting." After he left, Timothy stood up. "I should call my foster parents, let them know I'm okay. And Mom, maybe we could talk about me coming home for real this time." Margaret pulled him close, ignoring the pain in her shoulder. "Nothing would make me happier." When they were alone, Daniel sat back down on the bed. "You know, when you returned my briefcase that day, I thought you were giving me back my money, but you were really giving me back my soul." Margaret touched his face gently. "And you gave me back my dignity, my life, my son. There's one more thing I want to give you," Daniel said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Margaret's eyes widened. "Daniel?" "Not yet," he smiled, opening the box to reveal a simple key. "First, I want to give you a home. A real home for you and Timothy. The apartment above mine is empty. Take it, make it yours. Let me court you properly the way you deserve." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. "You know, all those nights on the streets, I used to look up at the city lights and wonder if anyone would ever see me again. Really see me. I see you, Margaret." "Collins," Daniel whispered, wiping away her tears. "And I'm never looking away." Outside the hospital window, the morning sun painted the city gold. Somewhere below, life went on. People hurrying to work, passing by the invisible ones on the streets. But in that hospital room, two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way were learning that sometimes the greatest wealth isn't in a briefcase full of money, but in the courage to open your heart and let love in. 2 weeks after the shooting, Margaret stood in the empty apartment above Daniel's penthouse, her new prosthetic leg feeling strange but remarkably comfortable. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the spacious rooms that would soon become home for her and Timothy. "What do you think?" Timothy asked, coming up beside her. He'd been staying with his foster parents, but spending every free moment with her as they planned their new life together. "It's overwhelming," Margaret admitted. "A few weeks ago I was sleeping behind the library. Now you're where you belong." Daniel's voice came from the doorway. He was carrying a box labeled Timothy's Books. The past 2 weeks had been a whirlwind. Frank's arrest had made national headlines, leading to a complete investigation of the insurance company that had denied Margaret's claim 5 years ago. It turned out her case wasn't the only one they'd mishandled. "The lawyers think you'll get a substantial settlement," Daniel said, setting down the box. "The insurance company wants to avoid a public scandal." Margaret shook her head. "I don't want their money." "Take it," Timothy urged. "Use it to help other people like you, people who lost everything because of corporate greed." Margaret looked at her son with pride. He'd grown so wise, so compassionate. The anger that had filled him for 5 years was transforming into a desire to make things right. The elevator dinged, and Sarah Chen walked in, carrying a stack of papers. She'd been Victoria's assistant at Hawthorne Industries, but after Victoria's resignation, she'd shown Daniel evidence of all the underhanded dealings she'd been forced to cover up. "The board approved everything," Sarah announced excitedly. "The new healthcare initiative for the homeless, the partnership with local shelters, the scholarship program for children of disabled parents, it's all going forward." Daniel smiled. "And the new position?" Sarah beamed at Margaret. "They want you to head the entire community outreach division. Your story has inspired a lot of people, Mrs. Collins." "Margaret," she corrected gently. "And I don't know anything about running a corporate division." "But you know everything about what people need," Daniel said. "The rest you can learn." Sarah's agreed to be your assistant. Timothy was exploring the apartment, opening doors and checking out rooms. "Mum, there's a room here that would be perfect for a home office. You could work from home sometimes, help people right from here." Margaret followed her son's voice, leaning slightly on her cane. The new prosthetic was amazing, but she was still getting used to it. The room Timothy had found was bright and peaceful, with a view of the park where she'd found Daniel's briefcase. "Life has a strange way of coming full circle," she mused. "Speaking of circles," Daniel pulled something from his pocket. The same small box from the hospital, but this time when he opened it, there was a ring inside. Simple, elegant, with a small diamond that caught the morning light. "Daniel." Margaret started, but he held up his hand. "Just listen. I know it's fast. I know we have a lot to figure out. But I've spent my whole life making quick decisions about money and business. Now, for the first time, I'm making a quick decision about love, and I've never been more certain of anything." Timothy appeared in the doorway, trying to hide his grin. "Margaret Collins," Daniel continued, "you showed me what real strength looks like. You taught me that true wealth isn't in a bank account, but in the capacity to care, to forgive, to love. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Margaret's eyes. She looked at Timothy, who nodded encouragingly. "He makes you smile, Mum," Timothy said, softly. "I haven't seen you smile like that since before everything happened." Margaret turned back to Daniel. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." As Daniel slipped the ring onto her finger, Sarah appeared with more news. "The press is downstairs. They want a statement about the engagement." Margaret tensed. The media attention still made her uncomfortable. "We don't have to say anything," Daniel assured her, but Margaret straightened her shoulders. "No, we should. Not about the engagement, that's ours, but about the new programs, about helping others who are struggling. Maybe somewhere out there someone else needs to hear that they're not invisible." Timothy grabbed her hand. "Can I come with you? I want to tell my story too. Maybe it'll help other kids understand their parents better." Margaret hugged her son. Close. 5 years ago she'd lost him because she was trying to protect him. Now they were stronger together because they were facing the truth together. Down in the lobby, reporters waited with cameras and microphones. But this time Margaret wasn't afraid. She had Timothy on one side, Daniel on the other, and a future full of purpose ahead of her. "Mrs. Collins," one reporter called out, "is it true you're taking over community outreach at Hawthorne Industries?" Margaret stepped forward, her new ring catching the light. "Please call me Margaret, and yes, it's true, but more importantly, I want to talk about the people out there who think they've lost everything. I want them to know that rock bottom isn't the end of their story. Sometimes it's just the beginning." As cameras flashed and questions flew, Margaret felt Daniel squeeze her hand. She thought about all the invisible people out there, sleeping in doorways and behind libraries, fighting battles no one saw. She'd been one of them. Now she had a chance to be their voice. "Tell us about the new healthcare initiative," another reporter asked. Margaret smiled, thinking of all the lives they could change. "It starts with seeing people," she said. "Really seeing them, learning their names, treating them with dignity. Because sometimes that's all someone needs to find the strength to stand up again." Timothy stepped forward, surprising everyone. "My mom taught me that," he said clearly into the microphones. "She taught me that true strength isn't in never falling down. It's in how many times you get back up." The reporters were captivated. Here was the real story, not just a rags to riches tale, but a story of family, redemption, and the kind of love that transforms not just two people, but an entire community. As Margaret looked at her son speaking with such passion, at Daniel watching them both with pride, at Sarah taking notes for their next meeting, she realized something profound. She'd spent 5 years being invisible, but she'd never been truly alone. Every person who'd shown her kindness, Jimmy at the diner, Mrs. Chen at the library, even the security guards who sometimes let her sleep in the building doorway, they'd all seen her humanity when she couldn't see it herself. Now it was her turn to see others, to help them find their way back to the light. Because sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money or shelter or even love. It's the simple acknowledgement that they exist, that they matter, that their story isn't over. And Margaret's story, it was just beginning. 6 months later, Margaret stood at the podium in the newly opened Hawthorne Community Health Center. Cameras flashed as she cut the ceremonial ribbon, her engagement ring sparkling under the lights. Timothy stood beside her, tall and proud in his new suit, while Daniel watched from the front row, his eyes filled with love and admiration. 365 days ago, Margaret began, her voice clear and strong, "I was sleeping on these very streets. Today we're opening a center that will help make sure nobody else has to do the same." The crowd included faces both familiar and new. Jimmy from the diner was there, beaming proudly. He'd been hired to run the center's cafeteria, providing healthy meals to those in need. Mrs. Chen from the library had helped design the reading room, stocked with books and computers for job searches and education. But most importantly, scattered throughout the audience were dozens of people still wearing the clothes of the streets, hope beginning to dawn in their tired eyes. These were the people Margaret had personally invited, the ones society had forgotten. "This isn't just a medical center," Margaret continued. "It's a place of new beginnings. Here, you'll find doctors who won't judge you, counselors who will listen to your story, and most importantly, people who will see you, really see you." In the 6 months since her engagement to Daniel, Margaret had thrown herself into transforming Hawthorne Industries' approach to community service. The old board members who'd opposed her appointment had been silenced by the results, not just in public goodwill, but in real, measurable impact on the community. Timothy stepped forward to speak next. At 17, he'd become the youngest member of the center's youth outreach program. "My mom taught me that everyone deserves a second chance," he said. "But more than that, she taught me that sometimes the people who seem to have lost everything are the ones who have the most to give." In the back of the room, Victoria stood quietly, almost unnoticed. She'd changed in the past months, humbled by her fall from grace. After leaving Hawthorne Industries, she'd struggled to find her place until Margaret, surprisingly, had reached out to her. "You understand high society," Margaret had told her. "You know how to make them open their wallets. Help me help others." Now Victoria ran the center's fundraising department, using her social connections for something meaningful for the first time in her life. She caught Margaret's eye and nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of how far they'd both come. Sarah Chen, who'd become Margaret's right hand in running the community programs, stepped up to announce the day's schedule. They were offering free medical checkups, job placement services, and housing assistance, but most importantly, they were offering dignity. As Margaret watched, the first group of homeless individuals being welcomed into the center, she felt Daniel's arm slip around her waist. "Proud of you," he whispered. "Proud of us," she corrected. "None of this would have happened if you hadn't been willing to see past appearances that day with the briefcase." A commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A woman had arrived. Clutching a small child, her face bruised, Margaret immediately moved toward them, remembering her own days of fear and desperation. "Welcome," she said softly, holding out her hand. "I'm Margaret. What's your name?" "Susan," the woman whispered, flinching slightly. I didn't know where else to go." "You came to the right place," Margaret assured her. She looked at Timothy, who immediately understood and went to get Sarah and the crisis counselor. Daniel watched as Margaret gently led Susan and her child to a private room. This was why he'd fallen in love with her, not because she'd returned his money, but because she had an infinite capacity for compassion, even after everything she'd been through. Later that evening, as the center's first day wound down, Margaret sat in her office looking at the framed photos on her desk. One showed her with Timothy at his recent debate team championship. Another captured the moment Daniel had proposed. But her favorite was a group photo of the center's staff, a mix of healthcare professionals, former homeless individuals who'd turned their lives around, and volunteers from all walks of life. A knock at her door revealed Timothy, looking thoughtful. "Mom, can we talk?" "Always," Margaret smiled, patting the chair beside her. "I've been thinking about college," Timothy said. "I know we talked about me going pre-med, but I want to study social work instead. I want to help kids who've been through what I went through." Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Timothy, I used to be so angry," he continued, "at you, at Dad, at the world. But now I understand that pain can either break you or make you stronger. You chose to be stronger, to help others. I want to do the same." Margaret hugged her son, marveling at the young man he'd become. The past couldn't be erased, the years they'd lost, the pain they'd endured, but it could be transformed into something meaningful. Daniel found them like that a few minutes later, coming to remind them about dinner reservations. He paused in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt the moment. "Come in," Margaret called, wiping her eyes. "We're just having a mother-son moment." "The best kind," Daniel smiled, joining them. "Everything okay?" Timothy nodded. "Just telling Mom about my college plans and—" He hesitated, then continued. "I was wondering if maybe after the wedding, if you wouldn't mind, if I could call you Dad." Daniel's eyes widened. He looked at Margaret, who was beaming through her tears, then back at Timothy. "I'd be honored," he said softly. Outside the office window, the city lights were coming on, the same lights Margaret used to watch from her spot behind the library. But now they didn't seem cold and distant. They were warm, welcoming, full of promise. A new family was forming, not just between Margaret, Daniel, and Timothy, but in the larger community they were building. Every person who walked through the center's doors became part of their extended family, each with their own story of struggle and hope. And Margaret, who had once been invisible, was now a beacon of light for others finding their way home. The garden of the Hawthorne estate was in full bloom, white roses and lilies creating a pathway to the flower-covered arch where Daniel waited. 1 year had passed since Margaret had returned his briefcase, and now they stood ready to begin their new life together. Timothy adjusted his bow tie nervously. As best man, he had both the rings and a speech to deliver. But more importantly, he had the chance to publicly honor the mother who had sacrificed everything for him. In the bridal suite, Margaret sat quietly as Sarah Chen put the finishing touches on her hair. The wedding dress was elegant but simple, chosen more for comfort than show. Her new prosthetic leg, specially designed for the occasion, gleamed softly beneath the hem. "The guests are all here," Sarah reported, "including some special ones." Margaret smiled, knowing who she meant. She'd insisted on inviting people from the community center, former homeless individuals who'd turned their lives around, families they'd helped reunite, people whose lives had been touched by their work. Victoria knocked softly before entering. Their relationship had evolved into an unexpected friendship, built on mutual respect and understanding. "Everything's ready," Victoria said, then paused. "Margaret, I want you to know how much you've taught me, about strength, about dignity, about what really matters." "We've all learned from each other," Margaret replied, standing carefully. "That's what family does." A soft knock at the door revealed Jimmy from the diner, looking dapper in a new suit. "Ready, kid? I've got my arm warmed up to walk you down that aisle." Margaret had asked Jimmy to give her away, remembering all the mornings he'd slipped her extra coffee and day-old pastries, treating her with kindness when she'd felt invisible to the world. The wedding music began to play, not the traditional march, but a gentle melody that Timothy had composed himself, a gift to his mother and soon-to-be stepfather. As Margaret walked down the aisle on Jimmy's arm, she saw faces that told the story of her journey. Mrs. Chen from the library, dabbing at her, eyes with a tissue. Susan, the woman who'd come to the center that first day, now safe and strong with her child beside her. Doctors and nurses from the hospital where she'd returned to work. Board members who'd learned to see beyond profit margins, and people from the streets who were finding their way back to life. Daniel's eyes filled with tears when he saw her. He remembered their first meeting, how she'd sat in his office asking only to hear her name spoken aloud. Now she walked toward him, not as a woman in need of rescue, but as his equal, his partner, his love. Timothy stood proudly beside Daniel, no longer the angry boy who'd blamed his mother, but a young man ready to carry their message of hope and redemption into the future. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Margaret could hardly hear the words over the beating of her heart. She and Daniel had written their own vows, simple and true like their love. "Margaret," Daniel said, his voice strong with emotion, "you taught me that true wealth isn't in what we own, but in what we give. In returning my briefcase, you gave me back my soul. In loving you, I found my purpose. I promise to spend every day helping you make the invisible visible, turning pain into purpose, and proving that love is the greatest dignity of all." Margaret squeezed his hands, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Daniel, you saw me when I was invisible. You heard me when I was silent. But more than that, you helped me see myself again. I promise to be your partner in all things, to help you keep your heart open, and to remind you every day that the greatest gifts can't be bought. They can only be given freely, with love." Timothy stepped forward with the rings, simple bands. That matched Margaret's engagement ring. As they exchanged them, he felt his own eyes welling up with tears. "By the power vested in me," the minister said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The garden erupted in cheers as Daniel and Margaret kissed. Timothy was the first to embrace them both, their little family finally whole. At the reception, Timothy stood to deliver his speech. He'd worked on it for weeks, wanting to get every word right. "A year ago," he began, "I was an angry kid who thought he'd lost everything. I blamed my mum for an accident that wasn't her fault, carrying hurt that wasn't mine to bear. But Mum never stopped loving me, never stopped trying to protect me, even when it meant letting me go." He turned to look at Margaret and Daniel. Then, Daniel came into our lives, not as a savior with a checkbook, but as someone who understood that true value isn't in bank accounts or business deals. Together they showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who sees you, who believes in you, who helps you become your best self. Raising his glass, Timothy concluded, "To my mom and Daniel, thank you for teaching me that love is the greatest dignity we can give each other. And to everyone here who's been part of their journey, thank you for being living proof that no one is invisible when we choose to really see each other." Later, as Margaret and Daniel shared their first dance, she caught glimpses of their extended family celebrating around them. Victoria deep in conversation with a board member about expanding the community center's programs. Sarah and Jimmy arranging take-home meals for their guests from the streets. Mrs. Chen discussing plans for a mobile library program with some volunteers. "Happy?" Daniel asked softly, holding her close. Margaret looked up at him, then around at the garden filled with people from all walks of life united in celebration. "More than happy," she replied, "grateful and ready." Ready for what? For whatever comes next, for helping more people, for building our family. For living every day remembering what it feels like to be invisible, so we never stop seeing those who need to be seen. As the evening drew to a close, Margaret and Timothy shared a private moment under the stars. "I love you, Mum," he said simply. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find my way back to you." "You never left," Margaret touched his cheek. "You were always in my heart, giving me strength to keep going, to be someone you could be proud of." Daniel joined them, wrapping his arms around them both. Together they looked out over the garden, where their new life had officially begun. But the real miracle wasn't in the beautiful wedding or the happy ending. It was in the journey that had brought them there. A journey that had started with a lost briefcase and an invisible woman, and had transformed into a story of love, redemption, and the incredible power of seeing the dignity in every human soul. Above them, the stars twinkled like the city lights Margaret used to watch from the streets. But now they weren't distant and cold. They were promises of hope, reminders that, even in the darkest times, light finds a way to shine through. And sometimes that light comes from the most unexpected places, from the people we pass by without seeing, from the hearts we touch when we finally learn to look with love. The end.